There's this concept in physics called tensegrity. It's a combination of the word tension and integrity. And the idea behind this is that there is a floating compression system, that these individual parts under compression in these isolated ways are all suspended and held together through tension. And so this structure is created through balance instead of rigidity. And when we think about a structure, we traditionally think about this old school idea of strength and form, right? I often want to compare a brick wall to a muscle. And our bodies can often be referred to as a tensegrity structure, a complex system between fascia, muscle, tendon, bone. And when we think about muscles, they can expand and contract. And when you think about a brick wall, although it does provide stability and structure, it doesn't have flexibility. And so I think that tensegrity describes the science of flexibility, of a modular structure. I think it might just be the perfect metaphor for our internal lives. When you look at all of the emotions, thoughts, feelings, and internal energies and currents that we have as people, I see those all as these individual kind of isolated components that then interact with one another. And in tensegrity, there's this idea that when there's tension and stress and pressure in one area of the structure, that even if it's bending and buckling and changing form, that it won't break. And when that tension is released, or as I like to think, even with ourselves, redistributed, it can return to its original form. This is why tensegrity is such an important concept when it comes to architecture and physics. But when we look at the human self, I think there's an emotional, spiritual tensegrity that we all have. In this way, tension actually takes on a new form and a new meaning. So instead of tension just being looked at something that we need to always release, I think we can reframe it and look at it as a necessity, as a component that keeps our strength and our structure and our form. And so instead of looking at tension always needing to be released or dissipated, we can look at it as it needs to be redistributed through our emotional system. And so if you're feeling a tension in one area of your life, maybe that just needs to then be redistributed. In this way, we can then see ourselves as highly modular, flexible, adaptive, and a structure that is very strong, but tied together through these points of tension and these floating individual components. And one really key thing with the concept of tensegrity, which I think is like the heart of why I related this to our emotional and spiritual selves, is the idea that the strength, the flexibility, and the structure is generated through an internal press stress, not a gravitational stress or gravitational pressure. That means that form is generated from within, not externally. And I think we often look at our world through an external lens. And so what does this mean? This means that if we can look at our strength and our perseverance and our growth being aided by shifting to emotional, spiritual tensegrity, we can move away from the idea that it comes from the gravitational compression. I would look at that as, expectations, relationships, jobs, any of those external validations and pressures that we feel in life. As soon as those shift or change, then our structure would crumble if we're basing it off of this external gravitational compression. But if it's about the internal, press stress, then we can also reframe stress We can reframe tension. We can reframe the pressures that we feel in life and look at those as having to just balance and redistribute and return to our original form, which I think is what you could look at it as like alignment, being in your flow state, being in your true highest self. So there's this really beautiful metaphor here, and I think that it can really be applied to so many things. We are these complex floating systems, and in that balance is where we find our form. There's a really interesting component to tensegrity as well. The idea that once you create a tensegrity structure, that if you were to use it as a component in a larger tensegrity structure or combine it with other tensegrity structures, you actually can create a lot larger tensegrity structure and a system. And I think about this in the way that when we do that internal balancing and then we plug into a community, that could just be our close friends, that could be family, it could be our sangha, it could be whatever it is for you, church, work environment. And then we plug into this larger system, maybe a system where those people are doing the work as well. We can create this really large system and structure based off of this internal balance versus a responsive or reactive, I think reactive is really the right word, setup that is based off of the outside world, based off of that gravitational compression of life. And so this concept just really stuck with me, and it's a really beautiful and profound way to look at ourselves as these complex beings, but that we can then, in that complexity, not demonize or beat up on ourselves for tension and stress that we experience, but see it as a necessity that just requires redistribution, rebalancing. I love that idea that in a tensegrity structure, if it loses form, it won't break. That is a true tensegrity structure. It's not going to break, and it will even return to its original form. And I think that is our true, grit, our true strength, especially when you look at something spiritually or emotionally. And this is something that, we can strive for. I think it can set a North Star. It can give us a new way of looking at ourselves and our lives. My friend who's a trained massage therapist and just a brilliant guy passed this word along to me. And I love that it's really not a fake word. I think it's a portmanteau, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a combination word. But also B, that it's often referred to in physics and architecture and, to his point, in kind of kinesiology and body work. And what's so interesting about that is the metaphor of like a muscle versus a wall, right? A wall is very rigid. Yes, it's strong, but it's rigid. A muscle can take new form, change shape. It can be rigid, it can be flowing, it can be soft, it can be hard. It can tense and become a structure and then release. And muscles are really based in tension and release, and so are we as beings. And so when you look at it as also something that's you can study and see in our bodies, the idea of tensegrity, it's already built into our design as humans, right? Even physically, we have these systems of floating compression. And so I think my call to action for all of us is looking more at our lives through a lens of floating compression and floating components versus this rigidity where things bend and break, but we can see it as things flexing, changing shape, and in that flexibility, in that malleability, we can find our true strength. I really appreciate each and every one of you for subscribing, listening, commenting, liking. It really, from the bottom of my heart, means so much. I hope to look back on this channel one day with hundreds of thousands of subscribers and know that, these early people who tuned in made this possible. So thank you, and I will see you on the next video.